Welcome to the Southern Voice Rock Show. Here's your host, Jim Harris.
Our guest today is the incredible Rudy Sarzo. Rudy has been a part of some of the most important and successful bands of the rock era, like Quiet Riot, Ozzy Osbourne, Whitesnake, Blue Oyster Cult, Dio, and the Guess Who. We're honored to have him with us today. Rudy, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today on the Southern Voice Rock Show. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, Rudy, just looking over your career, obviously the bands and artists you've been associated with, so many. I think you've played in all of my favorite bands except UFO and Lynyrd Skynyrd. Do you think there's any chance we could get those two worked out?
Since you mentioned UFO, and I love Lynyrd Skynyrd, but I've never had any immediate connection with the band except for, meeting Ricky Medlock years ago, when he was still in Blackfoot. Yeah, 40 years ago. So that would be my only real connection. And then DOC, when I was in Blue Oyster Cult, we did some shows with Lynyrd Skynyrd. And I must say that having done those shows with Lynyrd Skynyrd, I got a perception of the cultural impact that Lynyrd Skynyrd had in a certain collective consciousness that I think is prevalent in the South, Southern pride.
They certainly have made their mark.
Yes.
And stayed the course for a lot of years.
But in order for them to do that, they had to go deep into their photo album. When I watched the show from inside of the stage, I looked at the band, I looked at the audience, and I'm saying, this is a celebration of the memory and the legacy of the band. For each individual in the audience, the band meant something. There was a commonality with everybody else. There was a string that was attached to each person connecting them.
I think you said that as well as anyone ever has.
I watched it, and having now been given the opportunity to be back in Quiet Riot, I learned that from those shows that we did with Lynyrd Skynyrd. I treated exactly the same way as I felt Lynyrd Skynyrd was celebrating their own legacy and the memory of the members. I get the same emotion going on stage with today's version of Quiet Riot to celebrate the legacy of the band and the memory. But there's a connection to that moment when I got it, what Lynyrd Skynyrd was doing on stage, today's version of Lynyrd Skynyrd. Let's say with Quiet Riot, facts that you can attach to the band. If I say we opened the doors for the Sunset Strip bands by having a number one record, it's a fact, and a lot of the bands take that into consideration. So that makes us part of that revolution, that rock revolution of the early 80s MTV that opened up the doors for many other bands. I would say, in my case, all of them, my friends, and colleagues and people that I've even played with in other bands and things like that. So it's more of a celebration of that actual consciousness that everybody is somehow, some way entangled with as we go through life, because you don't leave anything behind. It's always now. So if you want to be in an 80s state of mind, you can. I do it. I will, because I am so connected to it. I have not disconnected myself from it.
Well, I think the 70s and 80s are by far, in my humble opinion, the greatest music ever produced.
Oh, absolutely. I was there. See, to me, the 70s were more of my formative years. Everything that formed me initially, the framework of who I am was definitely formed in the 70s. And then in the 80s, I started refining it and making it more my own and creating my own identity. And as I go through life, I continue to do that. But I never leave behind what was the blueprint for who I am.
Exactly. So you were born in Cuba and you moved to the U.S. as a young man. Did you actually get started in music in Cuba, or did that happen after you came to the States?
I got trained. My ear got trained with music in Cuba. And what was really interesting, we didn't have any, I was a kid. I didn't put any labels to it. Nowadays, you can do a search for music and there's let's say Latin jazz, which was a label back then. But now you have so many derivatives of Latin jazz. Anybody from Duke Ellington to Paquito de Rivera. So it runs the gamut. It's not just a few artists playing Latin jazz. And that's what I grew up with because that was the music of the day. That's what I heard every time my parents would take my brother and me to an event and there was music being played. That's what I heard. For me, it predates my own, let's say, the British invasion, the rock and roll British invasion that happened, let's say, in 1964 after the Beatles played on Ed Sullivan. That was kind of like all the stars of the universe aligned and this happened and it affected so many of us, affected a whole generation. Culturally, spiritually, fashion, you name it. The Beatles did that. And of course, along with the Beatles, again, kind of like opening the door, then you got everybody else that came in, from the Rolling Stones to the Animals and Jeff Beck and Led Zeppelin, and you just keep going from that.
You're known as one of the most important bass players in rock and roll history. Did you start on the bass or did you move there from a different instrument?
Actually, I started with guitar, but I don't consider myself because I'm just a work in progress. So for me to put a little label on me, it means like, okay, this is what you are, and we're going to put you in a little box. That's my own perception of myself. Any other perception anybody else might have of me, that's their own. And that's it. I have no control over that, and it's really none of my business. For as much as it might look that I'm trying to please people when I get up on stage, I'm very critical of myself. And I've been doing this for a long time. So it takes a lot of not critical, but digging in deep, seeing how further I can take myself, develop myself, do something new, surprise myself. I do that every night on stage. Maybe what I'm trying to say is I'm my own worst critic because it's me. And so what happens is if you can please yourself or entertain yourself, then I believe everybody else will get it. But if you just aim to entertain the first 5 rows of any given event, you're going to fail.
From a fan that's seen you live with a lot of different bands, I can say that I have always enjoyed every show with every band I've ever seen you with.
Well, thank you, sir. I really appreciate that.
Your first major band was an early version of Quiet Riot. How did that come about?
Yeah, I look at that band, even though that version did not really reach the success level that separately we would. But I would say it was the most important band for me, mainly because I got to play for the first time in a band that had a collective consciousness. And that meant that our consciousness was we're in Los Angeles. Here's where all the record labels are looking for bands. Our aim is to get a record deal. We never talked about politics. We didn't talk about religion. I can't recall any of that. We didn't even talk about who's going out with who, what girl's going out with who, any of the guys in the band. It was all about how we're going to do this. That was it. That was the first band I did that. At the core of that was Randy Rhoads. And I separate Randy from anybody I've ever played with just because he's the only musician that I have ever experienced playing in a band with that actually came from a musical family. I'm talking about both parents being music professors. They own a music school which still operates today. It's called Musonia in North Hollywood in the Los Angeles area. Many musicians have visited there just because what it represents. This is the birthplace of Randy's musicianship and musical integrity. His sister recently, Kathy, posted a photo of Randy on social media him holding a guitar, playing it for a little baby, like a random little kid that happened to be in the room, and that's exactly how I remember Randy. The same passion and commitment and integrity, musical integrity that he had in Quiet Riot when we were struggling because, new wave and punk were the flavor of the day at the time. In 78, 79, 79 is when Randy left the band because it wasn't getting anywhere in LA. I left the band and joined Ozzy. That same integrity was there, or even the next level of that. When I joined him in Ozzy, he took it to a whole different level. So Randy taught me so much. He taught me the other side of the reason why I started playing music. I started playing music because, I was a fat little kid and I saw the Beatles getting a reaction of all the girls. And I said, I want that. I just turned 13 when I saw the Beatles. I was invisible to the girls. I was like, I want that. And Randy taught me the other side of the coin, which is, you're doing this because it's all about the music.
You mentioned following him to Ozzy. How was life in the band with Ozzy and Randy?
I love Ozzy. I owe him and Sharon, my career, because even though Randy is the one who recommended me, it was them that say, okay, let's bring Rudy along with us. I had no resume. I was just, if you would ask me, so what have you done before you joined Ozzy? Well, I was sleeping on Kevin DuBro's floor and playing in his band DuBro. And I was also a member of another band called Angel, but we didn't have a record deal, so that was kind of moot. So, yeah, that was my resume. And with Ozzy is Ozzy. It is what it is, and he's as real as he gets. He's not trying to pretend to be anybody else but Ozzy Osbourne. He's been like that since I first met him. And with that, you get a lot of predictable unpredictability. You never know. I can predict what's going to happen in the next hour. You had no idea what's going to go on, but it will happen. You learn to navigate that. But at the end of the day, once we get up on stage, it was all about that. If you want to see a typical, okay, here's Ozzy. We are in the dressing room, all of us. These are like in the early days. One bus, one dressing room. Everybody knew what everybody else was doing. So Ozzy would be sitting on a corner, rocking in a chair, sitting on a chair, rocking. And his mantra was, I ain't doing it. So his Birmingham accent would be kind of like, are you doing it? Are you doing it? Over and over again. And, when I first witnessed that, I'm going like, wow, how are we going to go on stage with this guy? Miracles do happen. And with Ozzy, on tours, every night it was a miracle. Sharon would just like grab him, walk him on stage and shove him on stage. And that moment is when he turns into Ozzy Osbourne as known by the fans on stage.
Wow.
That's it. It's almost like watching the Wolfman, the movie The Wolfman, when it goes from like the regular guy character and then it turns into the Wolfman, starts ripping his clothes off and all that. That's basically what it was like every night to watch Ozzy go on stage.
Well, Rudy, you guys put together some incredible music. A question that I've thought, had the tragic accident not happened with Randy, would that version of the Ozzy Osbourne band have continued?
Well, what I'm going to say, it's been documented in various movies, documentary movies. And the fact is that Randy was going to go back to school. This is what I was talking about, the next level of musical integrity. He wanted to get his degree in music and become actually a session musician. He was not very happy playing, trying to paint the same, and I don't mean trying, but actually painting the same masterpiece every day on stage. He wasn't really built for that. He was built for new challenges, new music, new compositions. So he wanted to be more independent. Now, I'm not saying that he was not going to continue playing with Ozzy, kind of like what Zach Wilde does. He's got his own career solo, and then he plays with Ozzy. I'm not saying that. So that might have been something that after Randy got his degree, he might come back to Ozzy, continue working with him. But that was his goal. And his mom was looking to schools. There were other people in the industry looking to get him inside of the New York City session world, because he could read. So there was no problem of him putting a sheet music in front of him and performing it. He was at that level. That's what was going on at that moment. Now, if that started happening like within months right before the accident, the plane crash. Okay, let's say that plane crash did not happen in some alternate reality. What would have come out of that, like I mentioned, that he was making plans to go back to school right after the end of the tour, the Diary of a Madman tour? Would there have been other events that diverted the plan, or that put the plane on pause for a while? I cannot tell you, because the only reality that I know is the one that I have experienced.
The great question, what could have been with such an incredible talent?
He could have gone in so many different directions that it's actually very, very tough to pin down exactly what he will be doing today. Because he could have gone into, composing for motion picture. He could have been Danny Elfman before Danny Elfman. Who knows? I mean, but definitely music, and definitely at the top of his game, and just like he did for metal. Anything else he would have done outside of, that being a metal guitar player in a metal band, he would have taken that integrity and applied it into a whole different area. Like I mentioned, being like the Danny Elfman of, instead of Danny, it will be Randy, or also Danny and Randy doing that. Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of stories going around that basically say that you were a close call to actually being on that same plane that day, that you were invited but decided to get some sleep instead of joining the flight.
We used to do adventures together, and that was one of them, and I declined because I was raised in Florida, and I just wanted to get to the hotel room. It had been a long bus ride from Knoxville, Tennessee, down to Kissimmee, right outside of Orlando, for people who are not familiar. I just wanted to get to the hotel, and it had been a long winter for us, because my winter started in the fall when Ozzy started rehearsals in October in England. So while people were still in warm weather in a lot of the country in the United States, like California and Florida, which is where my family is from, and I lived at in both states, I was already feeling the cold weather early on, during that tour in October, and then by March it was like we had just finished doing the North during that leg of the Diary of a Madman tour, which would be the first leg of the tour, and it was like we were all ready for some sun. And by the time we got to Florida, there it was. But I didn't want to go on a plane. I wanted to go to lay by the pool. And that's why I decided not to get on the plane. There were so many things. I mean, I declined getting on that plane, but then you have Sharon, Ozzy, Tommy, myself from the band asleep in the bus when the bus was hit by the plane.
So very close.
Yeah.
And again, obviously one of rock and roll's great tragedies, but not too far down the road, that did lead to a reopening of the door with Quiet Riot. I think you became involved with recording one song that was a tribute to Randy, and that sort of led into you playing on most of the tracks on one of the most successful albums ever.
Mental Health.
In that particular situation, it seems that you and Kevin and Carlos and Frankie, I mean, for lack of a better way to describe it, you just caught lightning in a bottle. I mean, that was just absolutely the perfect album at the perfect time. And you guys just did an absolutely incredible job on Mental Health.
When things like that align, when the universe aligns with you, or God's will, it's almost like a test. It's kind of like, okay, God's going to give you this opportunity. Here you go. Okay, you got this. What are you going to do with it? It's a test. You know what I mean? In life.
What do you think about that album just resonated so well with your audiences? I mean, it just seemed like it was the perfect album at the time.
If I can put everything in a nutshell, it's just this tiny little, like you open up a fortune cookie and it reveals something, right? I would say the fact that Come On Feel the Noise is very similar to a nursery rhyme. 3 blind mice, come on, feel the noise, and I got proof of it because it is basically, right? We used to have kids, toddlers. The parents would bring them somehow. They would get backstage with the kids, probably friends of the promoter or something. And we're on tour with Black Sabbath. So it's not because they're coming to watch the headliner, because you don't bring a 2 or 3 year old, at least most of them, to a Black Sabbath show. And I love Black Sabbath, but it's not, they're not ready yet.
Right.
Especially in 1983. Okay. But they will be, let's say MTV was really beginning to make a mark across America, available in more cable systems, and people were actually paying a little bit extra just to get this MTV. And Come and Feel the Noise the video was getting played every half hour on the half hour. So a lot of kids, like parents do, they put the kids in front of TV, that's their babysitter. I grew up like that in the 50s. The TV kind of like kept me distracted. It was my mom's babysitter. The fact that we have we have a gold single for Come and Feel the Noise, and then we have a number 1 album for the record that came from. And our record was multi-platinum before we even ended that tour. Leads me to the fact that there was a whole different demographic that was actually buying, or the singles were meant to be for. And I would say it would be the parents who had a child that instead of buying the whole album, they would just say, okay, let's put in your little Mickey Mouse record player. Let's add this other song, which is another lullaby. And that's how we sold all those singles. I believe that they were sold for the parents bought it for all those kids. Because it doesn't make any sense that if you already have the album, because we went to number 1. And in those days, you have to sell 1 million in 1 week to get on number 1, because we're talking your competition is Michael Jackson's Thriller and The Police and Lionel Richie, all those big records from the 80s, right? We were selling records. So why buy a single if you already have the same song on your LP? The fact that we had a broad audience. We had toddlers and teenage headbangers and maybe some adults, because the Slade song, Come and Feel the Noise, was actually a 70s song. So there might have been some kind of like in mid-20s, people say, hey, I remember the song from Slade. Maybe they went also and bought the record due to that.
Well, that album has now been escalated up to, I think it's now 6 times platinum.
Yeah, I actually have a Diamond Award, which means it's a Diamond Award from 2003, 20 years ago. It went over 10 million.
It's still selling.
RIAA. Well, records, we don't know, because nobody really buys records anymore. You get some royalties in some shape or form. It just morphs into something else. And you just kept getting paid on that. So it's streaming now and downloads rather than actual purchases. And remember, if anybody buys your record and they buy it at the used record store, first of all, it doesn't chart. Second of all, you don't make any money from it. It's a used item. It's just being handed down from person to person.
You guys followed that up with Condition Critical that also went platinum. And then not too long after that, you exited Quiet Riot. What happened there? Was it just a personnel situation?
Yeah, it was just a personality conflict, I mean, when, again, success, it's a test. It's a blessing, but it's also a test. What you going to do with it? How you going to handle it? And sometimes you got the tools to handle it. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes people come into other people's lives and it becomes a toxic situation. All of us, we struggle. We were not children, kids. Well, I mean, we might have been mentally not as mature as we should have been because never, remember, we become musicians, so we can actually never grow up, And and in the 80s, nobody grew up in the 80s. Later on, we look back at it and we might have learned some lessons and say, okay, I'll never do that. It was not really what I would say a growing up period. It was more of a anything goes generation.
Yeah, I'd say that describes the 80s pretty well.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a lot of tests. Let's see how far we can take what you're doing and live, to talk about it someday. Some of us were worse than others. I was kind of like in the middle. I wasn't any better or much worse than anybody else. I was no angel, and I don't think there were too many angels out of that whole era.
I don't know that there were a whole lot of angels in the 70s and 80s in the rock and roll business, but
yeah.
Your next stop was a pretty significant one. You spent a few years with Whitesnake and were involved in some really big work with them. How was life in Whitesnake?
Oh, it was great. It was. I was a fan of the band before I even joined the band. So being raised on Deep Purple, the origins of Whitesnake go back to having 3 founding members of Whitesnake. Deep Purple members, of course, you got David Coverdale and you got Ian Pace, the drummer, and who was like the original drummer for the band, and John Lord, the original keyboard player for the band too. Of course, I followed them, and they always had great bass players, Neil Murray being one of them. We toured together in 1984. They opened up for Quiet Riot during the Condition Critical tour, so I got to know them very well. I had a lot of respect for the musicians and the musicianship and their legacy musically. And there were 2 opportunities for me and Tommy Aldridge, because we started working together again right after I left Quiet Riot. As soon as we got together, Tommy and I in 85, we got a call from Whitesnake management, and they wanted to talk to us, and they offered us the position, the rhythm section. And since I knew the band and I had seen what was going on, there was still some potential conflict, but due to the fact that I knew about the dynamics within the group, how people felt about other people and whatever. So I declined. I said, no, that's okay. I just left one situation. I don't want to go into another one. And but 2 years later, when we got another call, by now the record was done, but the whole band was gone. David had a record to release, but they didn't have the band. The people that played on the record have moved on to other things. And Tommy and I, we got the call again. And by then, it was just David left. So there was no conflict, no prior conflict existed in the band. So I say, yep, we're in, I'm in. And Tommy, of course, followed.
Well, you guys did some great work.
Oh, yeah, it was great. I mean, the 87 record was done. But I figured if I would have played on that 87 record, I would have not been on the tour. So it was like, okay. And then I got to record the following record, Slip of the Tongue. So I said, okay, I was on the 87 tour. Had a wonderful time and got to record Slip of the Tongue, and got to also tour with incredible musicians like Adrian Vandenberg, of course, Tommy and David, and and Vivian Campbell and Steve Vai. And, my last tour with Whitesnake was in '94. Then we had Warren from the Martini from Rat joined us, and of course Adrian Vandenberg, and so I got to play with some great people. Yeah.
Well, over the years, you've kind of gone back and forth with Quiet Riot. You've had quite a few in and outs. What is the draw that keeps you coming back to Quiet Riot?
Well, here's the deal. The first time that Quiet Riot ended for all of us was in 1979 when Randy left to join Ozzy. The band never again performed or recorded as Quiet Riot. It became Dubrow, which is Kevin's last name. And there were a lot of people in and out. I played in Dubrow up until I joined Ozzy for about 6 to 8 months prior to that. And I was living with Kevin. Then Randy passes, and I go back to playing with Kevin and Frankie, who I have been playing prior to Mental Health for 10 years. We came to LA together. We were finally during what became the Mental Health recording session when I went in to record Thunderbird as a tribute to Randy, which that's a song that I used to play in Dubrow with Kevin right before I joined Ozzy. So I knew the song. And then they added, said, okay, we recorded really quick. And then they asked me, do you remember Slick Black Cadillac, which is the only song that made it from the Randy Rhoads era to the Mental Health record. And Kevin wrote that one. And so that's another song I used to play. And then a couple of other Dubrow songs that I used to play. A lot of the material on Mental Health was written during the Dubrow period, right? Then I leave Ozzy and come back. And now you got two guys from Quiet Riot. We might as well call it Quiet Riot. You have Kevin, you have me now. And that became Quiet Riot. And then I left one time in '85. After that, I rejoined. We all got back together again in '97. And that lasted into 2003. And the band imploded. Nobody really left officially. It just broke up right there. And that was the last time that I was in the band before I just came back right after COVID, the COVID lockdown. I just left once. But like I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, it was home. This is where the whole concept, understanding the concept of musical integrity and the essence of the band, totally based on musical integrity, thanks to Randy Rhoads' influence. He was the key figure in the band, even way before I joined the band. He was the leader of the band. He's the one who at the heart of what Quiet Riot is all about, that's the heart that beats. Randy Rhoads. His musical integrity and guidance. He led by example. He didn't have to say anything because he was so purely a musician at a time when I got to LA, I met a lot of musicians who to them they were kind of getting into it. I was already in my 20s, and I met a lot of teenagers who later on would be key members, founding members of big bands. But they were still, I was one generation later because I moved to LA. And I was in my mid-20s when I was playing with the Randy Rhoads version of Quiet Riot. To me, I got it. I got it because I had experienced everything else, so much of it, that when I have actually experienced the real deal with the integrity of Randy Rhoads, I said, I get this. And this is the only way. Well, it's not only is it the only way, but as an example, the reason why Randy Rhoads is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland as a solo artist, not even with a band, is because of his musical integrity and the impact that his musical integrity had on other people that were actually part of the decision making to get him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
And much deserved.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. because it has an impact even today, 41 years after he passed.
Rudy, also in your career, you spent time with Yngwie Malmsteen, Dio, Blue Oyster Cult, Queensryche, but there's one band that you spent some time with that seems to not necessarily be musically an exact fit for a lot of your other book of work, and that's the Guess Who.
Well, before I get into the Guess Who, I just want to make something clear. Regarding Queensryche, personally, I never thought or felt that I was playing in Queensryche. The reason why I started playing with Jeff, it gave me an opportunity to not only play with Jeff Tate, a great singer, great music. He was doing we were doing the whole Mindcrime album. And I'm a fan of the band. We have a long legacy with Queensryche. Their first tour ever was with Quiet Riot back in 1983. I have a lot of respect for the guys, for the music, and I just want to make clear that there's only been one Queensryche bass player, and that's Eddie Jackson. I was the Jeff Tate other version of the band because they were in court and they were trying, this messy thing going on of who owns what and whatever. Me personally, I never considered being in Queensryche because I know Queensryche. Another good thing of having been on that tour with Jeff Tate was that I got to spend a lot of time with my sister, Sass Jordan. She was also a member of the tour, and we became dear friends. And her husband, Derek Sharp, has been the singer in the Guess Who for, my God, 15 years now, at least. And so when they were looking for a bass player, she recommended me. And it's that simple. And I love those guys. And I grew up with that music.
In addition to all of your other accomplishments, you also wrote a very critically acclaimed book about your time with Randy and with Ozzy Osbourne, Off the Rails. And that still gets a lot of buzz.
Yeah, I wrote it just, it's on the back of the book, in the back cover of the book, explaining why did I write this for? At the time that I did, I started writing it around 2001. There was so much misinformation and innuendos and conspiracy theories about Randy's crash. And I said, you know what, if I don't write something and set the story straight, this, the lies and the conspiracy theories will become facts. So they said, guys, this is what happened, and this is the way it went. And I just wrote it, and I put it out there.
Well, it is still available widely, so for those of you that are fans, I would recommend checking it out.
Download it as a Kindle or print. Just go to Amazon, and it's there if whoever's interested.
Well, Rudy, before we wind it down, I want to throw two other questions at you, if you don't mind. One is just sort of a broad, general question, but of all of the bands that you've played with over your illustrious career and all of the work that you've done, is there a band that stands out as being sort of the perfect combination of right people, right stuff, right time, that you felt like clicked better than maybe any other gig that you've had?
You're being now very, very specific about more of the human side of being in the band. Let's say the family that we pick. That's how we become a band. It has to do with the music and it has to do with the passion because that's part of it, but not necessarily because you're in the company of a virtuoso. I've been with virtuosos in bands, and sometimes it's like I don't get to know the individual as well as I'm in a band with a great musician who really understand what we're doing. We're not just playing a bunch of notes. There has to be a side of humanity that has to come out in your music to connect with the audience. Otherwise, they're not hearing. They're not. Your soul is not making the music anymore. It's your brain is making it.
Gotcha.
And that's just programming. That's what the brain holds, programming. It's your heart. And your heart has a brain in it too. Science, it's proving that now. So that's the brain that you want to play with, the one that's in your heart. That's the main brain. To me, this is the most clear purpose of any band that I've ever been in, which is me being back home in Quiet Riot. Gives me the ability to celebrate the legacy of the band that, to me, it goes back to the 70s playing with Randy Rhoads. That's the foundation of it. And celebrate the memories of Frankie Banali, Kevin DuBrow, and Randy Rhoads. That's it. That's everything else. It's a fractal of that and extends out like branches on a tree. But at the root of it, it's just what I just mentioned, the legacy and the memory of Quiet Riot. And I'm able to do it with a band that actually was picked before I even joined, because Alex Grossi, our guitar player, was groomed and picked by Kevin DuBrow over 20 years ago when he first started playing in the band. Then you have Jizzy that has his own legacy with his band Love Hate. And Kevin was a fan of the band, had a lot of respect for Jizzy. And when Kevin passed away, I told Frankie, after watching Jizzy with the band, I said, you finally found who you were looking for. So you can carry on with dignity without Kevin, Jizzy. And then Frankie picked Johnny Kelly, who has his own legacy with Typo Negative, being the drummer of the band. And I got to tell you, if Frankie and Kevin are not going to be with us, I could not go on stage with a better bunch of guys.
Man, that's awesome to hear. And how many dates are you guys doing a year, Rudy?
Well, we try to. Well, I just got back to the band last year, so we just keep adding more dates. And the more we play, it seems that everything is people. The audience enjoy us. The promoters enjoy having us. Being hosting us. It's really a very happy family. Regina, Frankie's wife, manages the band, and we'll work together again with the same mindset of celebrating the legacy of the band and the memory of the members who are no longer with us.
So, Rudy, is there a website or a social media outlet where you would recommend for folks to keep tabs on the band and keep up with your tour dates and so forth?
Yeah, QuietRiotBand.com, I believe. Social, because to me, websites are just like a window in a store. We are extremely active in social media. Jizzy Pearl has his own YouTube channel. Johnny Kelly does a lot of podcasts. So does Jizzy, so does Alex, myself, and we're always out there. So all you have to do is Google either Quiet Riot or any of the members in particular, and you're going to get a lot of references right there.
Awesome. Well, I know there's a lot of folks that would really like to catch up, and especially if you have a stop near their homes, I'm sure you'll have a lot of tickets sold. But from someone who has been a fan going back to, I think probably the first time I saw the band was 1983 in Atlanta. And so from somebody that's been a fan for a lot of years, I just want to say on behalf of all of our listeners, thank you so much for all that you've provided for us over the years.
It's always a pleasure. It's always a pleasure to play in the Atlanta, growing up in Florida, come on. That to me is like home, Florida, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina. Of course, you got Georgia, and some of the greatest memories playing in that area. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, we are forever grateful for all that you've done. And Rudy, I can't thank you enough for taking time to be with us today and sharing your stories with our listeners. And I can assure you this is going to be an episode that is really enjoyed.
I thank you so much. I'm very appreciative, and God bless you all.
Rudy Sarzo, everyone. In 1972, Humble Pie released Smokin', which was their first album without guitarist Peter Frampton. It contained the song 30 Days in the Hole, which would become one of their classic tracks. In this week's covers, we want to recommend the 2021 remake of 30 Days in the Hole by the supergroup Dead Daisies on their album Holy Ground. It's definitely worth a listen. In this week's Hidden Gem, we want to recommend the 1983 self-titled debut album by the Louisiana band Zebra. That album contained a couple of songs that got a lot of FM radio play, Who's Behind the Door and Tell Me What You Want. It went gold, but the band soon disappeared from the charts. The album contains some great rock and roll, and it's worth a listen. And by the way, the original band is still together and touring in 2023. We want to thank our guest, Rudy Sarzo, for being with us today, and we will be back next week with another great episode.
Thanks for listening.